Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Uh, Today we are looking at the next chapter, chapter 6 of Book 1. We're continuing the theme of slavery within the discussion. Remember, he deals with the question of what is politics. He talks about what is politics. He says it's the realm of the city, and then we try to define it, right? He's trying to define it. He first tries to define the city. Chapter 2, he gave a kind of a genetic account, right? Which disappears. You notice that if we last two chapters is almost like the account of chapter 2 really doesn't never existed. He's gone back to more pure this kind of logical, analytical, descriptive, historical aspects, and not really using the kind of thing. But it's still there. It's present, but it's really, if it exists at all, we will see it more in later chapters. But it's but at first glance, it seems almost not to exist. And then he talks about what is the city composed of, and it's composed of not of individuals, but of an aggregate called the households, oikos. The oikos are what are the oikos? Well, this is not merely a aggregation of individuals, but rather a series of relations between people or different actors. And he gives three relationships. He said that of master slave, husband wife, or parent child husband. No, first husband wife. Well, let's go back. Let's go back. Let's look at the. Let's kind of go back for a second for our purposes. I don't. It doesn't hurt us. We can go here, right? This is in chapter 3. Let's go look at it for a second. Just reviewing that. Um, he said it was, uh, 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 yeah, master slave, husband, wife, father, child. So, so therefore, that's the order he will go in that sense. Master slave, and that's why chapter 4 was about this. Chapter 5 continued this question of slavery, and now today we are going on the question of this about the slave, right? In fact, if chapter 4 was about the question of how slavery can be natural, chapter 5 was kind of addressing it a little further and dealing with the question of what is slavery in that fundamental sense as being, as aspect of, and how can it be advantageous. Again, chapter 5 seems to be about 4 seems about what slavery is. 5 seems to be about what natural slavery is and why it's justifiable. Now 6 is the opposite argument. So starting in 6, we get the negative argument, right? Those that assert that the opposite, that there are a certain are in a certain manner correct. However, it is not difficult to see. So therefore, those who assert the opposite of natural slavery, since since slavery and the slave are spoken of in a double sense, there is also a sort of slave or enslaved person according to convention, and this is chapter 20, no, a law, nomos. This is right, nomos. This is where the word nomos, by law. The convention, law, nomos, being a certain agreement under which things conquered in war are said to belong to the conquerors. This plea of justice, now again, remember, law is always a claim about justice. Law is always, in this sense, law is always kind of a claim made by a city about what the just is, or their belief about the just. Okay, remember that's the relationship between justice and law, is that it's like the relationship between opinion and truth. That in the sense that an opinion is a belief about something, it's our belief about something, uh, uh, um, um, uh, uh, and therefore law is kind of a society's authoritative belief about what the just is. So therefore, it's not justice per se; it's a kind of an opinion or a belief about things, right? This plea of justice is challenged by many of those conversant with the laws, as they would challenge an orator on a motion of illegality. 28. This is that the motion of legality is graphe parama, a technical term in Athenian jurisprudence, for a suit brought against anyone proposed in the public assembly measure countervening the fundamental law. So therefore, that this is, in other words, they'll challenge the claim that this is, in other words, the claim here is that in conventional law, when you conquer a people, conquer someone, you control them, you own them. This is the idea of slave. That this is the right of the conquest, right? And what happens here is that this is, as in Athens, and in other words, it would be challenged by an orator as a motion of illegality, something contrary to law, on the grounds that it is a terrible thing that if it is a terrible thing if what yields to force is to be enslaved and ruled by what is able to apply force and is superior in power. In other words, its argument is that the right, in other words, that right depends upon power. This is a terrible thing, Aristotle holds. That the argument that, in other words, what makes the question of conventional slavery wrong is that it seems to rest on the thing that, well, you have that right because you conquered it, you defeated it, and therefore you had power over it. And Aristotle seems to say, well, this doesn't sound right. This would make, as a principle of law, this is a bad, does this sets a bad precedent of that you would have a principle of the what the, in other words, what right is, right, is determined by the one who could yield power to it. If right is determined by power, in other words, on the grounds that it's a terrible thing, if that yields, what yields to force is to be enslaved and ruled by what is able to apply force and is superior in power. And there are some of the wise as well who hold this opinion, though some hold the other. In other words, in other words, there's not the wise don't. He says the wise ones, the sophoi, the sophoi, the wise, don't. Some hold that slavery is wrong, that it's wrong, that the powerful, in other words, this idea that slavery, the right to be enslaved, is because someone is able to impose force on you, and that this is and that this is what the one who yields to this is the slave, and the one who applies it is the master, is a terrible thing. And he says that many wise ones believe that this is wrong, but then other ones disagree with this. They argue that it is right. This is Thrasymachus, isn't it? All right. Justice is the right of the stronger, right? Thrasymachus' famous argument in Plato's first book of Plato's Republic, where Thrasymachus says that justice is the right of the stronger. So this is kind of that. Therefore, this is the debate over that in some sense. The question that there's something that doesn't seem right about it in that sense. But yes, this is the double-sided aspect. Something that while it has a bit of truth to it, but it also doesn't seem right. The three now, the cause of this dispute about the question whether force makes right. In other words, that's right. And what makes the argument converge is that virtue, or excellence, arete, once it obtains the necessary resources, is in a certain matter, in a certain manner, particular able to apply force. And what is dominated is always preeminent in some good. So it is held that there is no force without virtue, without excellence, and that the dispute concerning only, and that the dispute concerns only the plea of justice. So therefore, this is one argument. This is the argument that he argues that the concept that there can be no force without a virtue. Now there's arete, excellence, excellence. Now this is the problem about the soul. This is the argument. This is Plato's argument about the soul and the superiority of the rational part over the irrational part, and and how the soul rules the body despotically. Okay, and this goes back all the way back there. And he says that But then the question then becomes: is this and therefore this is what the argument seems to be, that therefore there can be no division of the. This is why this on things of virtue needs to have force to uphold it. If virtue is without force, then it's no longer virtue. Or that's even the question of law too, right? Law and justice. Justice without the sword is not justice, right? That's that famous line. This is why, we always, in every image of justice, we have the scales. The blinded lady who holds the blind is the goddess who's blindfolded, holds the scales of equity. This idea of justice, right? Equity, balance, but then at the same time holds a sword. Without the sword, justice is impotent. Okay, without the sword, the law is impotent. This is that idea. So therefore, this is why the idea that virtue implies some excellence applies something. Now he continues here, and that the dispute concerns only a plea of justice. He says, right? This is that. Let's continue. For on this account, the ones hold that goodwill is the measure of what is just, while the other holds that this very thing, the rule of the superior, is just. So therefore, in other words, goodwill is what is just, right? The real heart of the dispute is this distinction between one holds that goodwill, good intention, is the measure of what's unjust, whereas the other one says that the rule of the better one, the superior one, the one who is better, is the issue about what justice is. So right intention or the right of, you can argue that is right, but that means intention, right? Or does it mean what? I mean, this is the double side of the first part. The first part is um, uh, um, one holds that the goodwill, willing, the good. And actually, I have a problem here. I don't think this means will, um, right desire, right, because there's no will in Aristotle. I think this translation is a little flawed here. I would like to see what the other thing. I think it's. Uh, um, okay, I just simply. I'm sorry, but I phrased for a second. I went to the Greek, and it's the word here is eunonia, not will in this sense. Goodwill. It's one word. Eunonia. Nonia means kind of like care for it or desire for it. In that sense, we have a thing. So therefore, eunonia, um, that this is goodwill here is not a will that is good, but rather the eunonia, which is well intention, well. I'm seeking your good. I'm seeking your benefit. Okay, not whereas the other one is the question of that. Therefore, this idea here um, is what is just, the goodwill, the well intention, right? I think that's why I was right in that originally when I said this. And that the other one holds is that the rule of the superior is just. And anyway, if these arguments are set on the side, if these arguments are set on one side, the other arguments, which assume that what is better in virtue, or not to what is better in virtue or excellence, arete, ought not to rule or be master, have neither strength nor persuasiveness. And this is the idea here is this difficult passage has been variously interpreted. Newman comments on the one side argues from this that the force being applied by ex virtue and virtue attracting goodwill, slavery is just only where there is goodwill between the master and the slave, and that consequently the indiscriminate enslavement of those conquered in war is unjust. On the other side, that as force implies that the other side argues that as force implied virtue, wherever there is the force to enslave, there is the right to enslave. Right now, uh, um, this is the famous. This is Newman's. Or is it? This is, if I'm correct. Yeah, this is Newman's. This is the Newman is the four-volume turn of the last century. As we're entering in the early 20th century, Newman, an English a famous commentary, four-volume commentary on Aristotle's politics, and this is probably the definitive context, except to Schumann, is this German thinker in the late 80s and 90s, did another one, but only in German and not really been. It's a strange one. It's not really that useful in that sense. I've always discovered Newman is always better in that sense. So Newman offers a very good translation. Now, the goodwill of the manuscript, Inomia, had been questioned by some editors. And for this connection between goodwill, Inomia, and virtue, see ethics, right? This ethics chapter, line 1166b, that we have no other information about the debates over slavery in ancient Greek, and it is quite uncertain to whom Aristotle is referring here. And he makes a reference to Sanders' article on the question of slavery. So I think this is where we're going to stop here. This is where it continues. He goes, those who regard the slavery that results from war as just adhere wholly, as they suppose, to a sort of justice. For law is law is just in a certain sense. Yet at the same time, they deny implicitly that it is in fact always just. So therefore, law is just. He's saying that law is. Those who argue that this is the case, argues that don't they argue in a double sense. They argue they suppose a sort of justice, where they say for law is a certain sense, for law is just in a certain sense. Yet at the same time, they deny implicitly that it is always just, right? From the beginnings of war, for the beginnings of wars are not always just, and one would assert that someone not meriting enslavement ought. In other words, no one would assert that someone not meriting enslavement ought to ever to be a slave. In other words, the question is who deserves to be a slave. The idea is those who deserve to be a slave deserve to be a slave, and someone who does not deserve to be a slave made a slave. There's something wrong with that, right? Otherwise, the result will be that those held to be the best born will become slaves, and their offspring and the offsprings of slaves, if they happen to be captured, and all the offspring, if they happen to be captured and enslaved. So the best born ones would become slaves in this case. And he wants to argue, but the question of slavery, at one sense, is a question of the character. It should be the question of whether the person is best or not best, right? This is the idea. In other words, if slavery is to be just, it must say something about the character or quality of the person, that they are unfree. In other words, they're not capable of free. The argument in nature of slavery was that they lack the capacity to govern themselves. They lack that. That was the justification. But if that's not the case, if these people are the best born ones, and they're only slaves because they've been conquered, and their children, who are equally best born, are now are being sold as slaves, therefore there is a problem here, right? Accordingly, they do not, they do not want to speak as these are slaves, but rather barbarians. So they speak not about. When they say this, however, they are in search of nothing other than the slave by nature, of which we spoke at the beginning. Again, in other words, they speaking of nothing but the slave of nature, which they spoke at the beginning. For they must necessarily assert that there are some persons who are everywhere slaves, and others who are so nowhere. So therefore, what is happening is the argument of, first of all, they don't want to argue that they argue barbarian, but in arguing that the barbarian is these people are barbarians and therefore rightfully conquered in that sense, they're implicitly arguing the natural slave argument. In other words, in search that there is, in other words, they say this, however, they're in search of nothing other than the slave by nature, who we spoke at the beginning. For they must necessarily assert that there are some persons who are everywhere slaves, and others who are so nowhere. It is the same way. It is the same way with good birth as well. Those who have good birth, for they consider themselves well born, not only among their own, but everywhere. But barbarians only at home. The assumption being that there is something well born and free simply, and something not simply, and something not simply, but relatively. And he gives the example of Theodotes Helen saying, of as offshoot of divine roots on either side, who would dare call me a serving maid? And this is a Theodotus Frank. This is gives the reference to that line about Helen, right? This is Theodotus, the poet, writes about Helen, line from her saying, "As divine offshoot of divine roots on either side, who would dare call me a serving maid?" He's saying this that the idea is that there's two questions. One is the idea of he's saying that certain groups we can understand this, whether this is absolutely so or this is relatively so, about whether someone is a slave or something like this, or you deserve it. In other words, the is good the questions of being a slave and good birth, is this something that is simply so that applies everywhere in every place the same, but therefore, or is it this is something relative or conditional? In other words, so again, let's read this passage line again. He says, we speak, in other words, we say this way: there are a search of other than the slave of nature. Um, that there are some persons who are everywhere slaves, and others who are nowhere. Nowhere. In other words, this is the idea that this question is a universal question, or is it a conditional question that this is there are certain peoples, and that therefore these people are not seen as this. And in other words, this is the question: is there a common humanity, or are we just different groups of different animals? Now, this is the question. If you believe there's a common humanity, then the question is: then is it right then, therefore, to enslave those who are different but who are well born? Okay. In other words, he seems to say no in that sense. This is the idea here. This is the argument of that sense. He says the assumption being that there is something well born and free simply. Okay. Therefore, not only is there, the concept of the free and well born versus the unfree and the, the the opposite, right? The opposite of this, the natural, the one who is free versus the one who is unfree. And that's the fundamental difference in that. It is wrong to enslave the naturally free, but it is perfectly acceptable to enslave the one who is unfree. Right? This is not a, and therefore this is not a question of they're both human, but the question is the state of them. That's again the whole discussion of natural slavery that was earlier, right? In other words, when they speak of this way, it is nothing other than virtue or vice. In other words, arete excellence or vice that define what is the slave and what is free, who is well born and who is ill born. In other words, therefore, the question of those who, in fact, he's saying that it is the question of those who are virtuous. The free are those who are virtuous. Those who lack virtue do not possess virtue. By virtue does not mean being goody goody moral. It means the capacity to live your life well, live and know how to live properly. In order to make decisions, are able to discern. This goes back to the question of foresight, and then able to discern what actions I should choose that are for my benefit. Right? If I don't have the capacity to make the right choices for my benefit, and I depend upon others to give me that, I am no longer I lack virtue. I don't. I am not. It's not necessarily vice. Maybe it is vice in the sense that you lack. In other words, if you simply just don't have, you engage in things that harm you and do bad for you, then this is the idea. This is the again. This is the naturally the one who needs to be ruled for not only the sake of themselves, but also maybe the sake of others. They could do harm to others, right? This is the whole point about this. For they claim that from the good should come someone good. In other words, they claim that from the good should come someone good, as just as human beings come from a human being and a beast from beast. In other words, there's a kind of a logic he says here. The good, but this is a big problem now. Do I mean as human beings come from human beings come from beasts? We assume that the good should come from emerge out of the good. The good person, good parents should produce good children. This is kind of an assumption, he says. This is the assumption following the logic. Now, we all know that can be problematic. Sometimes good parents can bring horrible children, and bad parents can actually produce a person who's very good, right? This is not that simply clear, right? Now, again, but while nature wishes to do this, it is often unable to. So therefore, nature wishes that this happens, that the good produces the good and the bad produces the bad, but it's unable to. Okay, that it wishes this, but is often unable to. That there is some reason in this view, therefore, that it is not simply the case that the ones are slaves by nature and the others are free. Is clear. In other words, this is it is. In other words, there is some reason in this view, therefore, and that it is not simply the case that ones are slaves by nature and the others are free. This is clear, and also that such a distinction does not exist for some, where it is advantageous as well as just for the one to be enslaved and the other to be master. In other words, it is both advantageous. In other words, where it is advantageous as well as just. So therefore, there is this kind of conception here. Let me stop here. It says, um, others free, and it's clear, semicolon, right? And also that such a distinction does not exist for some, right? Where it is advantageous as well as just for one to be enslaved and the other to be mastered, semicolon, and the sentence, next sentence. And that the one ought to be ruled and the other ruled, and to rule by a sort of rule that is natural for them, comma, which is mastery, comma, while bad rule is disadvantageous for both. So, in other words, the nature of rule should be advantageous, mutually advantageous. And bad rule, therefore, the rule of a master, in other words, he's saying, what is he saying here? That it is not only well and just to be enslaved. In other words, it's where it's for the advantage and as well as justice for one to be enslaved and the other to be master. This is one. And that the one ought to be ruled and the other to rule, and this sort of rule is natural for them. This is the argument for natural slavery, which is mastery. In other words, while bad rule is disadvantageous for both. Okay. So therefore, this idea rule must be beneficial, and the idea here is that the slave must be benefiting from this. If it's not, if it's disadvantageous for both, now the both is what? What is the both referring here? Master and servant, or disadvantageous in the sense of, okay, yeah, but is in other words harms both of them. If bad rule harms not only his slave, it also harms the master. But isn't that the line in Jefferson's line in the famous section on slavery in Notes on the States of Virginia, where Jefferson kind of says, listen, this is a just God, there's going to be punishment. And he talks about how uh, 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 the practice of slavery not started to have a negative impact on the mores of the masters. So again, this is the point here. Aristotle's not saying that slavery is simply just. He's saying that it exists as a concept, natural slavery, but the purpose of it must be advantageous. That is the only kind of correct slavery. It must be done for the sake of or the benefit of. A mastery that is proper is a mastery that seeks the benefit of it. It's advantageous for both and good for both. If it can't be good for both, then it should be at least good for the I mean, it should be good at least. I mean, if it was only good for the slave and not good for the master, why would the master do it then? And but the tendency is that slavery tends only to be good for the master, not good for the uh, 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 um, slave. That this is the injustice of it, right? That the injustice of this slavery is that the advantage is not mutual. It's one sided, and it's one sided against the slave in that sense, right? That's would be the argument in that sense. That's from the logic of what we're doing here. But then at the same time, he says that it should be for the both, but then it's bad when bad rule is disadvantageous. For the same thing is advantageous for the part and the whole, and for the body and the soul. And while the slave is sort of a part of a master, a part of his body, as it were, an animate yet separate. And so therefore the slave is saying that this is the weird thing. The slave is part of yourself. The slave is really a part of a whole. And the whole here is the oikos in that sense, the family. And that therefore, that if you only understand the slave as something that you control and that you don't care for, this will not only, this harms the slave, but it also harms you. Here, the thing about here is that if you're going to have the slave, you have to take care. It is that thing that this is something you have to give care to. And that's it. It's part of you in this sense. The advantageous of in other words, anything that the same thing is advantageous for the part and the whole. So this is the question of the relationship between the part and the whole. As the soul rules the body despotically and is connected as a whole, the same thing as the master and the slave. They're part of a whole, and that is this household, yokos. And this is an animate entity. Okay? In other words, this is part of his body, the master, in a sense. It is, or animate and yet separate. There is thus a certain advantage, even a friendship of slave and master for one another. For those slaves who merit being such by nature, for those who do not merit it in this way, but who are slaves according to convention by force, the opposite is the case. Now, this is where he has that big article, section 31. Aristotle's notorious defense of natural slaves is problematic in a number of ways, and this has given rise to very diverse opinions. Some have argued that natural slaves are mentally deficient persons, essentially incapable of taking care of themselves, and that would imply that Aristotle was in fact a radical critic of slavery. And it is, as it existed in his day, Athens, for example, held some 100,000 slaves, twice the adult male population at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Others believe that natural slaves for him are deficiency moral rather than mentally, and potentially represent a larger group. And this is Peter Simpson's thing. And it is necessary to keep in mind the widespread sense of racial superiority among Polish-dwelling Greeks over the barbarians of the Balkans and the Persian Empire, who made a very large portion of the Greek slaves. This goes some way explaining the virtually universal acceptance among slavery as an institution. And indeed, to a great extent, that slavery was controversial. It was relative to the enslavement of other Greeks, right? And an important passage in Politics 7 of Aristotle appeals to difference in climate for the apparent innate differences between Greeks and those living north and the east. Greeks propose both intelligence, dianoia, and spiritedness conditions in Europe. On the other hand, for their development, the spiritedness without intelligence, nous, nous. Uh, uh, while those in Asia favor intelligence but not spiritedness. This, in turn, explains why Greeks regularly beat Asians in war and why Asians make especially good slaves. See Kraut. This is again. So this is a very good note here in the Lord, and I think this is a question. And the question of slavery is the big issue in Aristotle. This is why in The Good Place, the TV series The Good Place, when they get to heaven, and the guy wants to meet Aristotle. He can't. Aristotle's in hell because why? All the philosophers in hell because they defend slavery. It's not that they defend slavery; is that this is a question. This is now we end this chapter here with this concern about this, and there we end this question. He brings the question of whether the whole. In fact, this has been a really thoughtful debate how Aristotle's done this question about the question of the justice of slavery, whether it's just or not just. Now Aristotle might be here arguing that it's like all human things, justice is not perfect, and that while nature does that, in other words, there is a logic to the system of here, but it's always going to be imperfect. Okay, it's not going to be a kind of sense of perfect justice. And Lord's note here is actually very useful to help us understand what's going on here. And that his argument here is very interesting in that sense that if the only way just slaves are just is if they're by nature. If they're by convention, then and actually, and this is even more interesting, it must be advantageous, and also there would be a friendship between slaves and masters, and if and because why they would be as it since it's beneficial and advantageous, they become interdependent on each other, and this is the famous Axelrodish, evolution of cooperation, right? Therefore, there would become over time a friendship, but this is not the case when it's not just. It would be unjust, and it would be merely by force and think. And that therefore they would never be a kind of benefit, right? And there would never be a friendship, or advantage, or a friendship between master and slave. They'd be at war, echoing Locke's account. So that happens. That slavery is the imposition of will upon another, and that is the state of war, and therefore that any attempt to rule despotically over the slave another is the state of war over each other. So the condition of slavery is a state of war, and you never have friendship in that sense. So Aristotle seems to argue that if slavery is not based on a sense of that it's truly natural, naturally means it must be beneficial, that the slave is benefiting from this. If the slave is not benefiting from it, and it's then it is unjust in that sense. And if it's unjust and not advantageous, they will not be a friendship with them. They'd be at a condition of they'd be at this. This is how it ends. Okay, so that's the question. That is today's chapter. We finish chapter 6 tomorrow. Next time we'll go. Tomorrow you see us chapter 7. If you have any questions, put them below. If you liked us, like it. If you don't like us, you can always say no, and you can say why. This is a very controversial section in that sense. You can subscribe if you want to see more of these things. Encourage others to subscribe, please. Share this video to get other people if you want to think it's work like this. And if you wish to follow me on social media, the links are below. If you want to contribute as a contributor, help to kind of do this, you can do it through Subscribe Star or Patreon. Again, I'm still kind of new at this, and I don't really pay. I should be doing better on this. And the other thing you can do is you want to help support what I do here. You can buy. This is particularly since we're doing the Arab politics. My little book, the work notebook on Aristotle's politics. This is Cliff's notes on um, Aristotle's politics. It's a study guide. It helps you go through the politics. It's not an interpretation. It's basically it allows you to take notes on chapter by book. It's designed to kind of guide you through reading the text. It is something to be worked with a text, not in substitute of a text. Um, Help you to kind of work through it. Very complicated text. It has, and also leads you to the literature about the secondary literature about again. This is the secondary literature on the topics that may be relevant at the end of the book. That has a bibliography that goes breaks it down by even the topic it goes through. So again, that was something I borrowed. I got permission to use from someone that because it is a very good bibliography, and I thought it'd be good for that students and things like this would have access to it in a way more than having to go to a website that he had it on. So it's everything in here is designed to be a very effective study guide for the what you're doing on this. So you can buy it from Lulu or you buy it from Amazon. I don't care. I mean, I prefer you buying by Lulu because I will get the money that Amazon will get. Okay. So therefore, that's it. I hope you have a good day. Take care, and I'll see you tomorrow.